he wants to be on.
Okay. All right, let me share my screen. I'll play a quick video and then we go live. Hi, welcome everyone to the CannaTech webinar series. This week we're speaking with Matthew Anderson from Vanguard Scientific and Joel Sherlock from Vitalis, two of the leading extract companies in the cannabis space. And we're talking everything extraction. What is extraction, what to do, how to make money from it, and some of the pitfalls that are involved. And if you could just mention where you're from in the chat, just so we get an idea of who's joining us, and we'll jump straight in. So let's start with Joel. You're the founder and chairman of Vitalis. Tell us how you got into the cannabis space and specifically extraction and Vitalis.
Yeah, so I came in through, non-traditional methods, I guess you could say. I was on the finance side, with a big focus in real estate. And very early on in the Canadian legal program, I had some guys approach me and they wanted to lease my building and they had a license to grow cannabis. And, I laughed and didn't really believe that to be a factual statement at the time. Learned about it at that time, but that was back in 2001. So became the landlord to a cannabis company and then, invested in a plant food business and a lighting business. We'd kind of always been in the ancillary side of things. And then, transitioned into financing extraction machines, backing great science teams, and they were all buying machines. And we really went out to standardize to one platform. So wanted some customization, wasn't able to get it in the market, and went to some oil and gas engineers and then created the first Vitalis system 5.5 years ago.
Matt, from Vanguard, you're out in Oregon. How did you come to the cannabis extract space?
Troubled youth, Saul. First entrepreneurial endeavor was building a distillery in my garage. I spent 7 years in regulated products in the U.S. alcohol industry. We built a liquor brand, Enlightened Grain Spirits, and grew that nationally. Funny enough, for a wine and food event, I used Hindu Kush, which is a Portland, Oregon genetic. It's an Oregon purple Kush, and blended it with chanterelle mushrooms for a food and wine dinner, and had the euphoria and the exposure to alcohol, and a number of chefs and people experienced it at the same time. They loved it. I thought I'd hung the moon. That kind of crossed me into cannabis and alcohol. My dreams were quickly dashed, but regulations in Florida for Senate Bill 1030 came along, and I had the opportunity to work with a group that ultimately was awarded one of the first 5 licenses for processing, a full vertical license, which was incredible. Fast forwarding till today, I've had the opportunity to participate in the industry, much like Joel has from the private equity side. Through MacArthur Capital, we raised and deployed 2 funds into the space, touching the plant and not touching the plant. Vanguard Scientific was the first investment in our first fund. and then the first investment in our second fund. And I've been running the company now as CEO for about 2.5 years.
Amazing. So Matt, let's start with extraction efficiency. Bang for buck, what is going to get you the most product? And then afterwards, Joel, you'll jump into what people actually want from product. But extraction pricing and bang for buck out of systems.
Yep, sure. I'll step back and make the headline statement: not all oils are created equal. So it's important to understand that depending on what type of extraction technologies you're using and methods you're deploying, you're going to get different resulting oils. And kind of where Joel's probably going to touch on the buyer, the question is who's going to be procuring the oil you make. So when you talk around efficiencies, you need to think about throughput. Traditionally, high flow throughput, higher flow throughput CO2, cryoethanol solutions, as well as hydrocarbons have had the greatest extraction efficiency. But that being said, it depends on what you're doing in post-processing, whether you're looking to get to full spectrum or broad spectrum oils, straight into a distilled or far more concentrated product. You begin to make different choices about extraction efficiency. So I apologize the convoluted answer, Saul, but it really is dependent upon what type of oil you're trying to make.
So I guess, Joel, that's a perfect spot to go into different products. How do you choose your extraction system? What comes first? I guess you choose your product set and you build your extraction to match.
Yeah, I mean, what comes first or what should come first sometimes are different statements, but what should come first is really understanding, what biomass are you bringing in? Hemp or cannabis is one of the biggest, first decisions to make, or both. Potency, and then ultimately the best extraction method is really going to be determined by the jurisdiction and the resulting product you're looking to make. And one thing we always tell customers is, be very careful, because the only thing that's guaranteed for us is change. So, half the products you'll be making in a year from now, there's some amazing entrepreneurs just thinking of them. So making sure you have flexibility in that product ecosystem is really important. So you can bring different strains, different types of product, different potencies of product in, and then make different types of product out. I mean, if you're going to a distillate or a broad spectrum oil, that takes different extraction parameters and different post-processing equipment, as Matt was talking about. So it really, really does vary. But understanding those variables and then going out and figuring out what's the best is the best recommendation we usually have. And sometimes you might find that you need two extraction methodologies, right? You might want to use CO2 to take off the terpenes and get your higher quality product through here. And then ethanol is very efficient and fast, for one type of extraction.
So let's, I guess, talk about the various products that are on the market and how you get them. Difference, you've mentioned isolate, distillate, we know butters, shatters, crumbles. What are the processes that are getting these final products, and then how to integrate that into your facility design? Matt, you could go on to that afterwards.
Sure. So I think that we'll keep the conversation to actually commercial production. Cannabis and hemp extraction or concentrations have been going on for hundreds of years. So there's certainly craft methodologies that can get to different product types, but not in any sort of techno-economic efficiency. So kind of in ability to produce these to make them saleable as retail products, I think the focus initially is a full spectrum or broad spectrum oil. And that is an extraction process that utilizes predominantly CO2 as a main extraction method. And that captures the widest range of cannabinoids. That captures THC, CBD, and the rest of the minor cannabinoids, including phytometabolites, which are things like flavonoids and terpenes that are all really important as you start talking around the entourage effect and or ensemble effect. So the ability to access the endocannabinoid system with more than an isolated ingredient. So what you're seeing is these full spectrum extraction technologies, CO2, is being used not only to capture the flavor profile and the euphoric elements that are inside of these plants, but also being used in a medical setting to be able to then further concentrate, fraction, or distill into isolated compounds. that's a kind of a starting point for conversation. Joel?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's a good base for sure. And ultimately, it's important to remember that, the extraction methodology is one step. It's a very important step, but there are also post-processing technologies which are really, really important. So when you talk about broad spectrum oil, it really requires all of those steps, right? In some recreational markets in the US, hydrocarbon, which is a great solvent, operates very cold, gets a broad spectrum oil, but then you've got solvent and oil together. And then you have to take it into the lab and separate those two. So you have to look at not just the extraction step, but the post-processing steps when you're looking at cost, when you're looking at throughput and time, and when you're looking at what does that output product look like. And that's where, going back to what Matt was saying, traditionally CO2 has been, it's a very selectable solvent. So different pressure and temperature combinations will get different things out of the plant. In perfume industries, it's been used for decades, and it really is quite gentle on those terpenes and monoterpenes and some of those things that you really want in broad spectrum oils or higher quality products.
And so I guess let's talk about the difference between mass extraction, large companies like, I guess, Select or some of the bigger producers versus the craft extractor. What is the market telling, Joel? Where is the market going?
I mean, we've seen a big consolidation, right? I mean, one thing for us is we specialize and are the largest in the world for industrial scale equipment in the space. So, our machines are big, really big, and then, whole facilities. So when you look at someone like Select, they have a wide variety, right? If they're buying trim, it's going into an ethanol process and going out into a distillate, whereas they also have broad spectrum products. They've got a wide variety of products, right? They've got their THC lines, their CBD lines. So ultimately, they're at a sophistication level, and they have the budget to go out and make different processes for each of the product lines to really maximize efficiencies that come through there. And, that's a gross generalization to a lot of the bigger players that are in the marketplace, right? So while a CO2 setup is going to be your most flexible for varied outputs, when you get to a point of making a lot of distillate, you may want to look at CO2 for the first hour and then finish it in ethanol. And there's a lot of combinations that we can put in to really refine efficiencies in site. But again, that comes with, the CapEx to make the operational, efficiencies to get that price down at scale.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point, Joel. And Saul, the reality of it is what we're seeing here is, if you look at the beverage industry as kind of a parallel, you've got the distiller, right? The person that's making the oils. And then you've also got the brand house kind of living as one company, right? So as Joel's explained, trim coming in using ethanol, that's creating a standardized product. So companies probably have standard formulations, added terpene ratios, and are branding and marketing those effects to specific buyers. And then you have this regional, the fact that the cannabis is like grapes or wine. It grows in terroir, and regionality affects strains that can be grown. And that's a different extraction process. And that's this broad spectrum CO2 where someone wants to taste the hillside, that the actual cannabis was grown on. So you're getting luxury preference on both sides. I like to say one is an ultra premium, like the best Russian vodka you know of, right? That's so smooth you can't even taste it, but watch out how many you have. And then the other is that really good vintage of wine that there's scarcity around. So those conversations are really unique as they evolve.
And really important, to look at how markets evolve. Medical products and pharmaceutical APIs is that consistent product, right? DIN numbers need less than a 6% variation. Whereas like craft products, like we'd see in some of the recreational markets, that's where you want to accentuate what was naturally grown in the flower. Whereas in some pharmaceutical sides, we want to get consistency coming out. So it really can totally change the parameters you run, the equipment you need. It's a totally different lab.
Yep.
And so essentially we're going to see a bifurcation of the industry to pharma, which is GMP isolate driven, and wellness, craft, recreational, which will be driven by what the consumer demands, or products that we don't even know exist today.
Absolutely. I fully believe that. I mean, we're going to see, novel foods and pharmaceuticals really, and in different jurisdictions, they'll have different names, but, there'll be different barriers to entry to get into those facilities, different licenses to have, and then very different operating manuals, SOPs, cleanliness procedures, everything.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at just the ability to patent or protect a formulaic definition, you have to have isolated or specific ingredient sets that are replicable and consistent. On the other side, in this novel food or therapeutics wellness conversation, what you're talking about is the stewardship of the plant through its process and a representation of it in its natural form. The interesting thing that's going to happen as this conversation devolves is you look at different buyers. The Eastern medicine, or the non-single drug narcotic convention kind of theorists that say the sum is equal than more than its parts, are really going to continue to champion that you want to bring in these different minor cannabinoids, and that naturally is creating more benefit in a therapeutic and or potential medicinal statement. But that is kind of the underlying controversy, I guess, that might exist around botanics in general.
For sure. And actually, Maya had a question here, and it's important to talk about, right? I mean, when we talk about what some product is coming in and how product is going out and what the best efficiencies are, I mean, if you just want the CBD or you just want the THC, you can turn the pressures and temperatures way up and you can get through the material a lot faster, but you're going to burn off a lot of those terpenes, monoterpenes, flavonoids. You're going to burn off a lot of value that Mother Nature has put in that plant. And that might be what you want. But if you run cold, low, be it cold ethanol, cold CO2, a colder process is going to keep a lot of those lighter volatiles. So, just because it says extracted with CO2 or extracted with ethanol doesn't really tell you what temperature, what parameters they were using. And that's going to vary the output greatly.
Yeah, Joel, 100%. And Maya, to follow on with your question, do you think that reassembling compounds after CO2 extraction, after winterization and distillation, really respect entourage? I think the terminology, at least the one I like, is an ensemble effect. You certainly don't have the full spectrum of all the minor cannabinoids like Joel just walked through. A lot of those are adulterated and changed, but you are getting a more than singular ingredient set. And I think that, again, since there's no formalized lexicon, it's really on us as we communicate with each other and our clients to kind of begin to harmonize these words.
Okay, so let's talk about the startup costs involved in extraction. Joel, I guess you should take this since you do the financing behind the equipment as well. But what does it take to get an extraction facility up and running? And then we'll go into some of the licensing that might be required.
Yeah. I mean, costs it's such a, how long is a piece of string, right? I mean, the first thing you need to start with is scale. If you need a lab that's going to do 2 kilograms a day, or if you need a lab that's going to do 2 tons a day, both can be made. Very, very different price points. If you need a lab that can make just isolate as an output versus I want to be able to make distillate, isolate, broad spectrum oil, soft gels, gummy bears, everything. Of course, those are all a whole bunch of different lines. So all of that's possible. Really, really important to know, what are you putting in? What are you making out of that lab? Also really incredible and important to think about CapEx versus OpEx, right? I mean, to buy a machine that gives you full automation will be more expensive than, in your distillation process or in some of those pieces. But again, you're going to pay for that up front, and then you'll save over time versus spending less up front and paying more labor, solvent costs. All of these things are, as people start their businesses, they start to understand really what that looks like. If you buy an ethanol system that reclaims 60% of your solvent, or you buy an ethanol system that reclaims 80% of your solvent, that makes a huge difference in your monthly costs. As our sales manager says, CO2 is expensive once, and the wrong ethanol system can be expensive forever. but, and then as we were talking about earlier, it really, the last couple of months has really shown that we have to look at what else is going on in the globe, right? I mean, the demand on hand sanitizer recently has skyrocketed the cost of ethanol. So if you had a giant ethanol plant, outside forces have caused the costs of your solvent, which is your largest operational cost. So if you were in the growing space, it would be like if power went up 400%, that would really affect your numbers. So truly understanding what you're bringing in, how much you're bringing in, and what you're looking to put out. And then also taking a look at that OPEX, CAPEX trade-off. But, the facilities can go from the low millions to, 2030 if you're really building a whole facility, and north of that if you want to go, tons and tons per day at scale to 4 different outputs.
So Matt, into facility design, following Joel's comments, how do you begin design and implementation, even, before you've chosen what your product set is and what your extraction equipment's going to be?
Sure. First off, Joel, I love your statement, how long is a piece of string? And I've now stolen that and we're using it. But it's a kind of a similar conversation, Saul. We have to sit down with the customer, and what you have to establish is voice of customer, right? So it's all about aligning success metrics. What does success look like? And you really start on product description. So specifically, we talk around what end products are you trying to make, and walk backwards with the client into their oil set and ultimately their final equipment set. And that equipment set is based upon what products you want to make and then what your throughput needs are. The interesting thing that kind of Joel touched on is what the throughput today is and what it's going to be in a year and a half is going to be different. Most business operators perform markedly different, right? And we're here and we're going to here. And walking the client through that. This isn't a widget, right? We're not building an app and putting it on the App Store. You are creating a running manufacturing facility that's going to be operating inside of different degrees of controlled environment rigor. So when you say the machine's always going to work, right? Better always work. And my employees are always going to show up on time, and the input product's always going to have the same potency and you start to get estimations of what they can do. And most often what happens is clients are in this capital raise stage, or maybe have brought in their first rounds of dollars. And you kind of have to not play the adult in the room, but become a trusted advisor and say, look, you've got 2 shifts and a swing shift. Do you have anybody that knows how to run this equipment yet? Right. And then start looking and breaking down those unit economics like Joel mentioned, right? So I've got costs for CapEx for my equipment, but should you have a spike in a solvent cost, what's really affected there is your unit economics or your ability to meet the market. Other competitors are going to provide supplies of oil and you're not going to be able to compete. It'll be expensive forever. So all that's kind of coming together, what you have to also kind of get an understanding of is where the client's mindset is around facility requirements. So what level of understanding or what expertise do they already have around the table that can help unpack engineering, electrical, plumbing, HMIS or hazardous material quantities, and then what level of GMP or quality control understanding do they have? And each one of those things are really important in upfront fact-finding or needs analysis, because it prevents rework. And oftentimes it prevents our clients from having to spend additional monies with architects or engineers that may be experts in their own right, but have never built a controlled environment for the manufacturing of a pharmaceutical API. So I think that there's just a lot around why each room's built and the why of each finished product that goes into actual facility build out.
For sure. And it's probably important at this point to note the difference, like finding an equipment provider, be it Vanguard, Vitalis, or some of the others who really is going to help you through this in a consultative process and not just try and sell you some kit, right? Because truly understanding all of these variables can be the difference between success and failure. Even understanding when we're talking about industrial scale facilities, what are you doing with the waste, the raffinate that comes out of there? Because if it's soaked in ethanol, it's different destruction protocols than if it's just dried hemp that could be, composted. So understanding all of the steps from start to finish, even the ones that someone's trying to sell you equipment may not want to talk about, but for your business, it's essential to understand every step and every cost.
Yeah. So let's go into the difference between the hemp market and the cannabis market. What are some of the glaring differences that you're seeing? Because you're heavy into the scale agriculture side with the hemp and on the pharmaceutical side. So you're seeing both.
So I mean, on the hemp side, a big thing to consider is where you're actually located, right? Genetics that exist in that area are going to vary potencies. So, the registered genetics in China are very, very different than the registered genetics in Switzerland. With 1% THC, you could see 18, 20% CBD. So that potency is going to really vary what equipment is in there. So if you're extracting 4 or 5% hemp, or if you're extracting sort of 18 or 20%, that's going to be very, very different. So scale on the hemp side, very different. And then also we're starting to see outputs, right? I mean, you've got some registered extractors now of pharmaceutical level or API level CBD. Those labs have completely different needs than, a Colorado isolate manufacturer. So really understanding the jurisdiction you're in both now and where you want to be in a few years from now, extremely important. And that's going to have a huge discrepancy in the equipment you choose, the team you pick, and the needs that are associated with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we were talking a little bit earlier, you're going to see a real bifurcation in the market. There are those that are going to go out and follow the path of GW Pharmaceuticals that's really created an API out of CBD in the United States and now internationally through their public fund. But what we're going to see is these groups that are going through clinical trials that are looking to define medications for specific cause and build a business around that. Those supply chains from cultivation all the way through to final product retail and sale are going to look a lot different than those that are looking to produce hemp-derived oils and extracts that are going to be used in cosmetics or non-ingested products. We could unpack the international regulations versus the US, but I think just kind of keeping it like that and really saying there are an apple and oranges conversation, while they might look the same, the requirements to be able to actually manufacture, process, and effectively sell is only going to continue to be upregulated globally as this moves into a mainstream market.
And let's go into offtake. You've got to sell your product at the end of the day. So what's moving? What does the marketplace look like at this point, and how is it evolving?
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, as Alan Gertner had said previously, right? When coffee came onto the market, like, good coffee was strong coffee. How strong is that coffee? And then it quickly evolves into, this is organic over here and I'm willing to pay for it. This is, consistency, all of those things. Now, over top of client preference and what the market demand is, we also have regulatory change. So, looking at what's happening right now in the UK, where there was a big push to just isolate, it had to be THC free, but now it has to be novel foods approved. So, the bar was just raised. So like understanding, again, as Matt was talking about, where you are, excuse me, and then also understanding where the regulations are going, and they're only going in one direction. And that's really going to vary price. Demand has really shifted away from isolate, or I guess supply has come up on isolate. Price has come way down in a lot of markets. And so broad spectrum oil has become really in demand. THC free broad spectrum oil on the CBD front, which is kind of a bit of an, an oxymoron, but we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But, it's something with more terpenes and still THC free. And then when you look at an API level, which very, very few people have, GW or Brains Bioceuticals, that's again, another leap in both price and sort of difficulty to manufacture.
Yeah. So stepping back from the product and just, how do you sell I'll kind of address that. I'll use two parallels again. Let's use Minute Maid and Ocean Spray as comparisons. And the thesis is, in this industry, the processor, the centralized processor, since it's a new industry and there's an undefined market, has to have a selling organization. They have to go find the buyer. So this centralized processor, in order to create Minute Maid that's sold globally, has to produce a uniform formula that tastes the same 365 days a year on all the continents. And how do they do it? And it's supply chain management, right? So they're beginning to source from different farms, 14 different types of oranges all around the world, in order to formulate it inside of their lab and deliver this consistent product. Same thing for Ocean Spray. They have centralized processing, and they use what are called power purchase agreements. Power purchase agreements reach upstream into the fields. They provide uniform genetics to the farmers. Those farmers are growing under contract that are going to produce a like ingredient under like standards and then feed that supply chain. So as you look to be able to find offtake, at least from our experience, for deep bids, for long reoccurring bids, the sophisticated buyer doesn't want to carry any of the risk. They want it to hit their dock on time, every time, within a tolerance of consistency. And depending on how big the buyer is, and depending on whether they're from consumer packaged goods, alcohol, or otherwise, they're going to expect you to be bringing the insurance for that supply chain. So you'll find yourself, depending on the scale of your business, after you've built out your processing facility and you have the client, they're going to ask you to sign something. And you're going to have that gut check moment. And that really is, are you willing to be responsible upstream? And do you have the supply chain in place? Do your growers going to follow the right practice? Are they going to grow the right genetics? So you can process the expected potency, as Joel mentioned, because the engineering team from either Vitalis or Vanguard have come in and worked with your team because you've had expectations around what the starting biomass is. And you've worked on label formulas that are going to match that. And that degree of consistency and how tight that package is, that good manufacturing practices, the quality assurances, the qualifications that have gone into your equipment, and the final certificates of analysis that make that oil, what you've got then is a differentiated product amongst the sea of commodity. And those are the transactions that we see moving. And it takes a lot of discipline around the operators of the processing company to understand that it's not just a standard oil business. They have to handle other parts of this supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And so that pushes back the conversation towards the craft over the mass. And again, it's not binary. It's not one or the other. The mass is going to end up with CBD in Coca-Cola, and the craft is the craft beer, craft wine industry that you mentioned before. So is there a difference in the CBD hemp side with that as well, or it's going big regulation, big products, CPGs, or do you feel the hemp market is moving to full spectrum craft oil as well?
In the States, I'll go first. In the States, there's definitely both. You've got California, USDA organic, you've Oregon Tilt certified organic. You have buyers that are like from this life science of health and sustainability demographic. They care where it comes from. They turn the label over on Whole Foods. They care about the farmer. That's a luxury marketplace in the craft sector. Internationally, Joel, I've got opinion, but I'd love you to give your opinion here.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on wine, we've touched on coffee. There's going to be a lot of parallels there, right? I mean, there's general consumer shifts, people going and looking at more of the food chain, reading the ingredients and voting with their dollar. We're seeing that just generally in, be it grain to milk to vegetables, whatever. And we're seeing the same thing here. So I think ultimately there's going to be the suppliers of consistent output at a reasonable price, and that's going to the Coca-Colas. And then there's also going to be, I think there'll forever be that sort of craft. Where was it grown? What is the strain, that strain specific broad spectrum oil? I think both will exist, and there's absolutely, an exciting business model in both for sure.
Amazing. I have a good question from Dr. Resnick. He's a specialist in cannabinoid medicine. And as a physician, he wants to know the extent in which the extracted content is correlated with the whole flower cannabinoid. If you're taking, I guess he's asking, a strain, how do you ensure that the final product has that therapeutic value, and how does the doctor know that it has that therapeutic value?
Doctor? What I would say is this. I think for a processing, for our clients, the way in which we control that GMP to GLP process is all about material handling and intake. So you have material comes into a facility, you're held into a quality release, you quarantine a batch that goes for a certificate of analysis. That can be done in-house if you already have an incoming COA from the farmer. You match like product, assure that apples are apples. You can do a multitude of batch testing. If you're in pharma, you're going to do multiple batches per lot. From there, as you go through extracts during each phase or state change of the oil, you'll pull a sample, continuing to trace it. If you're using crypto or blockchain-enabled traceability technology, that'll all be auditable. And then you move into a formulated product. That formulated product will have a number of sub-identifiers. Those sub-identifiers will actually tie all the way through custody to what's called real-world evidence, or that incoming COA. And in that way, it's turned into a product binder at the pharmaceutical level, and the doctor's label has to match, and that's called true to label. So the label will match the standing certificates of authenticity and validation behind it.
Mm-hmm. And important, I mean, physicians, we typically see, two camps, and I understand both, right? There's physicians who want double-blind clinical trials that need a consistent product going in, and that traditionally requires a different extraction set, a different processing set to get, a product that's going to be the same output even when there's a variance of input, right? Then there's, the physicians who are looking for a broad spectrum oil, and we don't know exactly how that entourage effect works, but we know it exists. So, that becomes more difficult to put into a double-blind clinical because, you've got variance in that product. So there's usually two camps. In the broad spectrum, it's traditionally, take a look at the extraction parameters and the extraction methodology, and the COAs, right, to see what other cannabinoids are there, and that's really gonna dictate, what did they put in, and then what's the makeup of the oil that came out. And then, of course, when we go to the more pharmaceutical route, they'll have all documentation to make sure the product has, little to no variance, an API level.
A question from Casey in the audience. What means broad spectrum THC free product from a legal point of view in the EU? Is it a product that has no THC or a below allowable quantities? I'll just provide a quick answer there. The allowable quantity metric is 0.3, depending on where you are internationally or nationally. 0% THC or THC free, as Joel mentioned, is an actual product where THC has either been converted or flipped into CBN or remediated and taken out. The most capable technology that we've seen on unit economics efficiency is a technology called harmonic distillation. Vanguard has a product that we offer that offers this service, but also superfluid chromatography has been seen as the ability to actually fractionate or separate minor cannabinoids. It's just important to mention it's a very highly cost per each because of the actual column costs, and it takes a high level of expertise to actually operate the technology.
And what would that add to the cost? So I've extracted a full spectrum oil, obviously contains some THC. Post-process cost to remove the THC is what?
I mean, unit economics per gram. Saul, I'll tell you, we can produce from biomass all the way through to a THC-free oil. Using good process engineering, you can deliver that for under $1 if you built the equipment, built the processing line the right way.
Yeah, there are some scale issues there. A lot of that right now, to be able to do that at at barrels per day is not quite. That science is still being developed to keep the consistency to it. But yeah, absolutely, I would agree with the price estimates there. But again, quantity is going to vary that quite a bit.
Yep, absolutely.
And the THC that you're pulling off, you're able to collect and sell as an isolate?
Depends on what license you have and what jurisdiction you're in. If you're in if you're in an area that does not have a medical cannabis license, or if you only have an agricultural hemp license, some areas you have to extract it and then destroy it, and you have to track, weigh destruction protocols and prove it. If you have both in an area like Denmark, for instance, if you had both licenses, you would be able to extract it off and sell that as a product as well. One would go under your hemp license, the other would go into your medical cannabis license.
And typically a hemp and cannabis license can operate on the same facility?
Again,
I know in Utah they can't.
Yeah, so in a lot of US states, no. In a lot of EU jurisdictions, it's looking more and more like you will be able to. But again, until those regulations are printed and on paper, that's a pretty big gamble to look at. So definitely another thing people need to consider.
And then another, I guess, barrier is certain states require that you extract on site. And that means putting in extraction equipment essentially for one season a year. How are people getting around that?
Sure. One of the things that we've done with clients is help them develop a GMP not GMP certified mobile processing solution that can actually pass seismic using ISO certified shipping containers that are outfitted with the appropriate extraction, post-processing and remediation technologies. And we've had success for those deployed internationally, and that's usually a lower cost. We've seen entrepreneurial folks take those and put them on large trailers and then drive them from site to site. So there are options in in-field processing. Joel?
Yeah, I mean, talking about scale again, right? If you're taking a crop down, which is, 2 tons, and you want to get through it in a month, that's a much larger lab that then may sit idle for 11 months of the year. Or do you build, if you're taking down 100 tons, do you want to extract that over a period of 6 or 8 months? Then we have to look at storage, refrigerated storage, drying capabilities. There's a lot of different pieces. So again, it really boils down to how quickly you want to get through that volume. If you want to harvest and extract all of it in 2 weeks and you have a large harvest, that's a very large lab. And then you want to think about, what am I going to do with this lab for the 11 or the other 50, 52 weeks of the year?
And
Which is often not thought of, by the way, Saul. That point that Joel mentions is very real.
And THC extracted from hemp in the US, if your crop is under 0.3, that THC is theoretically a legally derived cannabinoid. Any comments around that?
Waste handling procedures in your quality management system. You got to move it quickly into your waste stream after your quality check, and then handle it appropriate as your work instructions. That's the guidance.
But really important as well to look at, has the jurisdiction that's rolled out a license thought about that? Because we have seen 2, not to pick on any of the regulators, so I won't tell you where, but definitely look into it or reach out, that had protocols and they'd handed out extraction licenses, but, with the caveat that at no point ever can you go over that 0.3, even during the extraction process, which extraction is concentration of everything that's there. So, without looking at it, designing an extractor, which is in an enclosed case, which separates out the THC and then dilutes it down. So you're pulling out like THC and a solution. It would be impossible not to contravene those regulations. So definitely look at how those regs and how that jurisdiction is going to work with your business model.
Yeah, Joel, just for anyone that's dealing with your own jurisdiction, it's a state change conversation in the way the regs are written. So you want to look for allowable biochemistry, which says exactly that. So everything that happens during the extraction process is called work in process. And there's no, it's kind of like a gray zone. And then as it comes out post biochemistry or a formulated product, that's what it's tested at with its allowable levels of THC. So you'll be able to see or not see that language that Joel's mentioning there.
And you mentioned before the ongoing costs. So the initial setup costs, the licensing, your GMP, everyone sort of understands that. But then what are your ongoing extraction costs that are deal breakers, and how can you get them down?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, at scale, all of these costs, again, they're linear. So automation which can be a double-edged sword, right? I mean, because of that variance of product coming in and the variance of product going out, you may want less automation on your extractor. But in your post-processing lab, you may want more automation. So definitely, I mean, we could dive into that, but so that's going to be one. Solvent costs, that's going to be a huge one. So, you know, how much CO2 are you going through? Usually not a big cost, but ethanol can be very expensive. In an EU GMP environment, if you don't have the proper cleaning and testing parameters, you may not be able to reuse that solvent. That gets extremely expensive. And then we have seen in some jurisdictions where your ethanol soaked biomass as a waste can be a hazardous waste. And so now all of a sudden you have to pay for your biomass to bring it in the lab, and you have to pay to take it away. So in those jurisdictions, you may want to look at CO2, which would be higher cost up front, but you know, less operating costs all the way through.
Yeah, those are all really good points. The solvent cost overall, right? Because it's a commodity product, and it's the value is going to continue to drop until it plateaus. What that floor is going to be determined by the producers that can sustain. So, you know, really thinking about that ongoing cost per gram, not only has your waste stream and your solvents, but automation, as Joel touched on. I think process engineering is a big piece here. Anyone that's done material handling, material balance, or time and motion studies, they understand this is how do I use my labor the wisest? What's automated? What's manual? And the ability to have technologies actually be running while your employees are doing other functions inside of your lab is something that we really deploy inside of the facilities we build. The Midas CO2 system is fully automated. For instance, you can actually get push notification to your cell phone. But what it enables an operator to do is to do a CO2 extraction of terpenes. The system automatically moves to a full spectrum or broad spectrum CO2 extraction cycle, allowing the operator, in Joel's example and the way that we deploy systems, to then move that biomass into an ethanol stream for greater extraction efficiency. And the whole thing you're trying to do is get that unit economic cost down by driving processing efficiency.
And yeah, I guess, you know, the probably the most important is looking at the extraction efficiency itself. So of the cannabinoids you're looking for in the biomass that you've bought or grown and put into your lab, how much are you extracting out? Because ultimately the science dictates that. And there's, you know, you got to sift through a lot of the sales speak that some of the manufacturers will put out where they say, you know, 2 hours, 100% extraction, no winterization needed. You know, there might be some magical commas in there where you know, it can do a 2-hour extraction. It can get 100%. And this parameter may not need winterization. But all of those together, you know, the science traditionally doesn't allow that to happen. So, you know, looking at, there's a diminishing yield curve on extraction. So really understanding, do you want to get 70%, 80%, 90%, or, you know, 99.9% of the available cannabinoids, but understanding what that may do to throughput. Takes more time.
How much solvent can be reclaimed in the systems?
I mean, there was a question about that earlier. Again, it's going to very much depend on the jurisdiction you're in. In an EU GMP environment, you know, there's risk variances. So, you know, batch to batch, are you reusing solvent? If so, you know, how are you filtering it? How are you making sure that there's no contamination going from one batch to the other? So, you know, you may not be able to reuse it there. You know, CO2 traditionally is going to, in a closed loop extractor, you know, in a single batch, you should be all right. Replacing that, you know, then that's less cost than taking all of your ethanol, throwing it out, and then buying new equipment. But it's going to be jurisdictionally based, and it's going to be in your QMS or SOPs. So in your quality management system or your standard operating procedures would dictate what you do batch to batch when you change your solvents, your cleaning parameters, and that's what the regulators are going to review and approve. So it is really going to change every jurisdiction.
Yeah, and Saul, it's important to understand also that Joel mentioned, you know, the solvent reusability in an EU GMP environment. The regulators themselves don't have experience around this. So there's not only a documentation requirement, but there's a lacking domain expertise. So you have to provide without reasonable doubt. I mean, you have to go to the nth degree to prove that there are no contaminants in this reused solvent. And again, as Joel mentioned, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, the same work instructions, SOPs, and QMS that provide cleaning instructions that meet EU GMP rigor might not be accepted. So it's really important as you move into these conversations to have these upfront communications with the notified bodies or auditors that may come later and say, that's great, but that $350,000 piece of equipment you purchased, you can't use it. And that's on the small scale. So I think those are really important considerations.
Very valid point. And you know, just so as we have seen this in labs that have approached us to help, you know, they've built something, but they weren't able to get it approved until they could fix some of these challenges. Well, if it's a large ethanol lab and the challenge is, you know, we need to be able to reuse solvent, or economically this doesn't make sense, you know, you almost have to build another still purification and lab business next to it. So you can move your ethanol over there, bring it back to a solvent grade, certify it, and then test it, and then bring it back over. You know, that could be an additional couple $1 million, which is always, you know, never a happy surprise.
And then if you're looking at novel cannabinoids and acidic compounds, what would your extraction recommendations be?
As cold as possible.
And is that ethanol only, or are there other systems that'll extract acidics?
Sure. Well, shameless plug, our Midas CO2 system has had some extraction COAs that carried some acids still post-extraction in our monoterpene pulls. But honestly, to keep acids, it really is a solventless process in which there's no heat exchanged and or a very cold process. You see ice hash successfully preserving acids and or a cryoethanol process.
Yeah, and when you get to CO2, I mean, to operate with CO2 in a liquid phase like that, most systems that exist are powered by a compressor. Some systems, again, you know, like a Vitalis has you've got a piston powered pump on it. So we're actually able to move the liquid form of CO2 and keep it much, much colder. So ultimately, I mean, temperature is the leading piece on that. I mean, an ice water hash or some of those, you're not going to get 100% of the available, but you do get a really beautiful craft product. So again, looking at the extraction method determined by where you're looking to sell that product.
And you see acidic products hitting the market. I've seen a few from Europe that are coming about, but it hasn't been a big focus today.
It has not been a marketed focus. You know, we do know some science teams who are very excited about it. I'm really, you know, watching those results. But again, when we go back to what the customer is demanding, and ultimately those colder processes take more expensive equipment and traditionally more time. So, you know, once the customer starts to demand them more and vote with their dollar, then, you know, then they'll go ahead and make more. But yeah, there's a lot of really exciting science being done right now. And I think that's what makes me jump out of bed every morning.
And for companies out there, how do you reach your target audience? What is your ideal company profile that you would like to work with? Matt?
Yeah, sure. Ideal company profile. One of the things we said last year, we serviced 24 clients across 6 continents. Our goal was to decrease the number of clients we serve this year. Given the pandemic, I don't think we'll have an issue with that. But the intent upon that is a lot of this stuff, if you can't tell from this conversation, is dependent upon the client's ability to perform or customer fitness. So these are long lead time projects from facility build all the way through to final operation. And it's our teams that show up, Vitalis and Vanguard and the other suppliers or integrators that show up, that have to deploy a ton of know-how. So there's a ton of tech transfer and a ton of knowledge transfer. And to get halfway through a project with a client who's not understanding what the final 50 yards are going to take is incredibly damaging to the business. So qualifying the customer is something that we do upfront as they qualify Vanguard. we think it's really important just to be transparent and understanding, again, what success looks like and defining that statement of work clearly up front.
And I think it's important when, you know, these entrepreneurs who are listening now are building your teams, you know, there is a variance or varied expertise required to really make a successful team. I mean, you have to understand the financial side, but that doesn't exist without, you know, if you're in an EU GMP environment, someone who understands documentation, you know, the paperwork side of a QMS, all of that detail. And then also, you know, if you've got a pharmaceutical team who's never touched cannabis before, it's a very, very different extraction process than, say, getting lavender oil out of lavender, single volatile extraction versus, you know, all of the beautiful pieces that Mother Nature has put into this plant, and the varied parameters you need to be able to reach in and get different pieces. You know, that needs a very experienced but a wide variety of skill sets on the team. And then once you tick all those boxes, those are traditionally the groups that we've seen succeed short term and win long term. And I do think the current crisis we're in right now is going to test, you know, a lot of the equipment manufacturers and also a lot of the extractors that exist. You know, some of our clients are having some of their best years ever, best months ever, because everybody's stocked up on wine, weed, and toilet paper. Whereas, you know, other groups are having challenges. I mean, same thing with some manufacturers who are debt free, and, you know, we've had to change some of our manufacturing parameters, but we've been able to keep going. We're an essential service. Whereas I think some of the manufacturers that exist may not make it through this, which is an unfortunate reality, but a reality nonetheless.
Amazing. I know Matt has a hard stop. You guys have brought a world of information. I know a little bit about extraction and didn't really get everything that you've said. But people from the community, we are launching our digital communications app through Hoover. We'll send everyone who registered a link so that you can ask questions and continue the conversation after this. And I'll make available introductions for anyone that's looking to get in touch with Vitalis or Vanguard Scientific for equipment and obviously knowledge and transfer. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Very much appreciated that you give your time for educating the public as to what we can do with cannabis extraction.
Thanks for having me.
Saul, thank you for having us, and thanks for taking the time to put these together. It's very appreciative.
Yeah, we continue educating in the new digital reality.
We can't see you in Israel or Cape Town, but we'll visit you and the rest of the CannaTech team here. It's awesome. Thanks for having us.
L'chaim. Have a good one, guys.